Okay, bladder empty, coffee mug full, ready to go.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I'm Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
Now I'm Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us. Today we are talking about the topic of world building. We are continuing our series. Whether it's going to be a two-parter or a three-parter is up in the air still. But today we are going to be specifically talking about the bottom-up method of world creation. And one of the things that I discovered as I was researching this is that some sources, including the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition book, don't call it bottom-up. They prefer to call it middle out. And we'll kind of go into why on that here in just a little bit. But to start us out, I am going to read from Wikipedia about the bottom-up approach. From Wikipedia, with the bottom-up approach, the designer focuses on a small part of the world needed for his or her purposes. This location is given considerable detail, such as geography, culture, social structure, government, politics, commerce, and history. Prominent local individuals may be described, including their relationships to each other. The surrounding areas are then described in a lower level of detail, with description growing more general with increasing distance from the initial location. The designer can subsequently enhance the description of other areas in the world. For example, an author may create fictional currencies and refer to fictional books to add detail to their world. So, with that base understanding, how have you guys used bottom up or middle out for your games? Because my current game that I am playing on Thursday nights, my Scarred Marches campaign, last time we talked, I kind of gave it as an example of a way in which someone could do top down, but really, honestly, I used more of the bottom up in order to create this, because the way I created this campaign was I had the central keep where the player characters were going to be. That was their home base. And I just literally filled out the map around them as adventures came up. Like if I haven't created an adventure for a particular area, that area literally does not exist. There is nothing written about it. There was very little history that was done. I just did a very bare bones history of the world of the region. I didn't even do a history of the world, just of the region. And I've got to say, this is the first time that I've ever really leaned this hard on doing a bottom up or a middle out, and I think it's working out a whole lot better than doing the top down, because I'm not running into the problem with the top down of just running out of steam as you're creating things, because it really spreads the work out rather than having it all front loaded at the beginning of the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that your first instinct as a DM, whenever you're sitting down to create a game or create a world or whatever, is you have the fear of, well, I need to explain every single corner of this map. Say if you've made a map and that's kind of your launching off point. There needs to be no mystery. There needs to be, because what if the players go there? I think is what always is in the back of my mind. But the bottom up approach, when done well, it keeps the players' interest. The more developed the local structures are, the more relevant the immediate terrain, story hook, town, the more fleshed out your local area is, the more interesting it'll be for your players. And I found the less they want to leave.
Yeah, that was going to be my question for you, Clayton, is how do you keep people, within the zone that you've already fleshed out?
Well, here's the trick. Whenever the player characters say, okay, there's a blank spot in the map over here, we want to go directly there. Okay, I pull out some random counters. I pull out some random encounter tables. I start rolling on those, and more often than not, there will be some sort of a random encounter that happens between there and then. And maybe somebody who hasn't had 20 years of dungeon mastering experience might not be able to do on the fly of create, just based on the bare bones of a random encounter, like a story to basically tie the session over until the end of the session so that you have the entirety of the week in order to come up with an adventure at the blank spot on the map that they're heading to. But that's one of the things that I did setting everything up is I created basically a series of concentric rings around the central location. And in order to pass from one ring to the other, these rings are something that only I am aware of that exist. There is something that happens on the border of each one of these rings. There is some sort of encounter. There's some sort of an event that is triggered once they go beyond that basically gives me that buffer. It gives me that excuse of, oh, you guys ran into something along the way. Here's what you've got to deal with that's going to last the rest of the session.
So you throw up a diversion to buy you time between now and next week when you actually need to build in that part of the world.
Exactly.
It's a good call.
I mean, and I think this is a dangerous approach, but something I've thought about too in this area is, it's okay for nothing to be there. I mean, it's okay for the players to, if the players are trying to figure out your story and they just are wrong about a conclusion, say that they take a riddle or a clue and they think, oh, well, I bet it's over on that mountain that the DM mentioned, back in the first session, that's 100 miles to the north. Let's go check that mountain. I mean, if you as a DM know, that's not where I put that. I haven't really generated content there. I mean, they just get there and there's nothing there. That's a dangerous philosophy though, because if that happens too much, that should be a clue that you have not written a clear, storyline, and maybe you have a boring story for your players on their hand, because if they're trying to range out into the unknown, that kind of is almost an indictment on the content that you've created in the local region that you expected them to be in. But, there are some instances where I think it's okay to just, let people draw the wrong conclusion and they learn from the fact that there's nothing there. It's like, this isn't where we're supposed to go, and that just kind of leaves them scratching their head. But that's okay. That happens in the real world.
But here's one of the strengths of this method is if they do go to the wrong place, if you haven't put all the detail out there to define all of these things, there is nothing to say that it is the wrong place once they get there, because you have the freedom to move things around if you want to make it so that their conclusion is right. They're never going to second guess that their conclusion was wrong and that you moved things around for them. They're never going to look at that deeper. So if they come to the conclusion that something is there and you think that it's worth doing, that it's worth moving your stuff around, you can absolutely move it to there, and nobody is ever going to notice that, oh,
that's true.
By the original intent, they were wrong.
That works really well for like dungeons. Like say that they have a location that you either have already, created that they're going to go into. That's going to be like kind of an encounter system. And I guess if there's like, if you put a plot out there, it's like, well, there's a random NPC that lives out in this region. And they just hit the dartboard wrong. Yeah, there's no reason why all of a sudden that is the right place. Or, yeah, the dungeon's in this mountain. Good job, guys. Even though you expected it to be in the swamps or whatever. I mean, ultimately, they're getting there. That's the point.
And the options of there's nothing there or the thing is really there, those are not the only two options. There's also other options of it's not empty. There is something there. It's just not what you expected. It's just not what you had planned on. So, one thing that I like to have particularly in my Scarred Marches game, is I have several dungeons set up that I don't have a location on the map where this is where this thing is. I have some dungeons that exist solely to float around and be wherever they need to be at a particular time.
That is a trick that I'm just now figuring out. I'm glad to hear you say that, because as I'm generating content going forward, I've been grappling with that. Like, how much of these, story arc clues or locations or, I don't know, milestones, I guess you could say, in the story do I need to just kind of leave vague as far as location and geography, so as to just make it more serve the narrative, and then you have a little bit more freedom. Though sometimes you do need to lock things down. Like there's a subtlety in it that I think you just have to learn from experience.
I hope that I know for a fact at least one of the players who play in that game listens to this podcast, so I hope he's not hearing too much about how the sausage is made.
Well, do you think, I can't imagine that this is system specific. And this kind of process, I think, really fits just RPGs as a medium of game. But, I think D&D in general really lends itself to dropping yourself in another world, and by buying, like, say, the Eberron system, or, putting it in a large module like Strahd or one of those types of things. And then that gives you the freedom to let the book that you've purchased, worry about the details. And then it gives you the freedom to do better what you're doing, what you're talking about, I think. It's like you have custom made content that you can leave a little bit less rooted, or you drop a city into a pre-existing campaign setting that's your creation, and then you just flesh it out. And then if the players either need to or desire to go elsewhere, you can just drop into the book and just drop into the content somebody else has made. But what about like other systems? Like, I know your system in particular, Jordan, Apocalyptia, it doesn't have the benefit of a large pre-made campaign. How do you imagine people should go about building a game in your world, in your system that is ideal?
Well, listening to you guys talk, you're describing modular design, and it never ceases to amaze me how much intersection there is between role-playing game design and like software engineering. And I think that there's like an overarching kind of sort of physics of information that applies to all of these things. That it's part math, it's part information architecture. It has to do with symbols. It can do with like narrative arc and things like that. Like, all these things are, the philosophy and interrelationships of these, units of information and how they work together logically. And what Clayton was describing a minute ago, where you just have this, maybe not insulated, but certainly singular unit of game content that you can drop in wherever you want. That's a module in software engineering terms, and that's kind of the way that everything is designed these days. And that's the way that I design my game, because that's just how my headspace is always where it's always at. And to borrow a little more from software engineering, there's this idea of interfaces, and that's kind of the border between these different modules, these discrete units of software or information, game content, whatever, and how they link up with each other. And you've got, if you have a fairly defined interface that things can plug into, then that's the shape of the puzzle pieces, and you can switch those in and out however you want. But that's something that you want to think about. And I tried doing that in my game in Apocalyptia by kind of categorizing those areas into there's like 6 different types of zones, going from like central urban kind of areas out to like wilderness and like all the kind of suburbs and countryside and all that kind of stuff on that spectrum in between. And those things can hop 1 or 2 from one to another, but you never have a situation where it goes from like urban center, financial district downtown into like, wilderness out in the fucking mountains somewhere, like right next to each other in the same zone. It has to have this feeling of continuity, and because that's how the world works. And so that's something to definitely take into consideration when you're thinking about how to chunk up your world, is like gradual changes from one place to another, so it feels like a natural flow of terrain and culture and whatever. So yeah.
I mean, I think something that pops into my mind too, listening to you talk, is something that a DM needs to think about, because the way I imagine these last two podcasts, or all the world building podcasts, if we do a third, is like really, I think we're taking the approach of like, for our experience as DMs and gamers, and trying to give advice to someone either new to it or maybe frustrated with their way of doing it. So I'm trying to think about it from the terms of like, what, if someone's listening, what you should do when you're writing your game, what pitfalls to avoid. So like in your game is more or less set in a modern world. I know it's like kind of a take on it. There's like some future stuff, but the modes of transportation, a detail, something as simple as that is extremely important when you're thinking about, bottom up design or even top down. One way that you're going to ensure that the content you're generating stays in front of the player's face is the ways that they travel. If you're a DM and you're playing, say, D&D, and you're making a storyline that you're worried about them kind of going outside the bubble, going outside the sandbox and finding nothing but blank space, you probably shouldn't give them a magic carpet. You probably shouldn't put a really intricate set of teleportation circles in your world. You need to be thinking about, one way to make sure that they don't go beyond your, break the illusion, is just not only giving them good content, good characters to interact with when you're designing from the bottom up to keep them glued to a place, but also don't tempt them. Don't give them a super fast horse and then say that there's something in that direction. Keep it fuzzy. I would even think like something I've been thinking about myself lately is don't give them a map. Like that seems so like such a, I know in my games, especially playing on Roll20, it's so tempting to just make a world map, fill it with stuff, upload it, and then make that your landing page. That's a terrible idea if you're trying to keep it reined in. So, as a DM, don't like tell your players they can't go any place, but you can kind of encourage them to go certain areas by, maybe you don't give them a map, maybe you give them a map of a town and they have to figure out how to get there or whatever, but like don't give them a lead to a place you don't intend them to go.
I'm a big fan of like a fog of war kind of feeling of things. Like I would appreciate if a DM would show us a map of the places that we've been and then leave the rest as, white space. But prior to that, you brought up a really good point that I've like been very aware of when I've run Apocalyptia and other stuff too, is having an idea of what your party's travel potential is at any given time. Be that, how much water they have, how many days rations, how many gallons of gas. Like that's something I'm always looking at. If I'm running Apocalyptia, is if they just decided to drive west until they just sputter out, how far do they get? And that gives you a radius of stuff that you might need to, prepare for. And, yeah, the magic carpet's a great example. Games just break down as soon as somebody can do long range teleports, right, Clayton?
Absolutely, yes.
Clayton, why don't you discuss what we realized recently that, when you told me, because I was actually probing my players, because we're at a hinge point, we're about to open up a different section of the game, and so I've been thinking a lot about, golly, where could they go? And we reread a spell that we've just been playing wrong, and as a DM, I was just like, yes, thank God. Because it's about transportation and fly speed, and just the distance that a party can travel makes all the difference. Here, do you want to clue us in, Clayton, or clue the listeners in?
Well, I don't want to embarrass myself by explaining
sorry.
how badly I got a very basic rule wrong.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to do that.
So I'll go ahead with the one Jordan alluded to, because that one was squarely on my shoulders, my fault as the game master for giving him the ability to do this. But in our Abena game, I gave Jordan an ability to teleport as far as he could see, and didn't realize at the time that I gave him, that I allowed him to take this spell, that this world was flat, so there was no horizon, so you could literally see from one end of the world to the other. You would just have to see up into the sky. And so, yeah, that the ability of a player character to just be able to teleport from literally one end of the world to the other, or because of the way the magic system worked, he could teleport like at an angle up, and then just basically hop by teleportation in the way that Nightcrawler does in X-Men from one location to the other at an incredible amount of speed. The only limitation that he had on that was the fact that this ability was only... I don't remember if it was only for you or if it was incredibly hard. It was a lot harder to bring additional people along, and so you just stuck with doing it just you so that you didn't risk fucking up the teleportation.
That's exactly what it was. I teleported the whole group like one time because it was really hard and it might like kill people if I fucked it up. But if it was just me, it was no big deal. I could also return to places I'd been to before, even if I couldn't see them at the time. So that was pretty hot. But yeah, doing one teleport, however many thousands of feet up in the air, and then basically looking down at the world map that's actually below me, and then just picking a spot and going there. That was hot.
As a player, that's really exciting, but as a DM, that's terrifying.
Yes, it is very terrifying, because suddenly a player character can get literally to the next destination that I wasn't planning on you guys reaching for another in-game week of sailing across the sea. Suddenly you're there, but then you've got the downside of the one player character is there. If shit goes down, he's basically got to teleport back, but that's invaluable recon.
Mm-hmm.
True. Like in our game, there's nothing I can, there is one way I know that like I have like a druid. So say that you're playing in like, I think it's an 8th level druid whenever they get the ability to really get the giant eagle and fly. So there's no way for me to get around the fact that Adam's character as an individual can go, I've added it up, it's like 50 miles a day, if I'm not mistaken, in any direction, because he gets that wild shape twice, and he can be in that shape for 4 hours at a time. That's a technical difficulty, but something to think about too for anybody who's building a game from the bottom up, and then they're worried about a big empty map beyond it is, in my experience with closing up Strahd, looking forward, that was my big concern was, oh no, as soon as the mist open up and the players can travel out into the world, I have to have content for them. Because in my mind, I was like, well, of course they're going to want to go see what else is out there. And, when you've played a game in a local area, if you've done your work and you've created really engaging NPCs and you've got really interesting towns that by, a couple of sessions in, the players are invested in it. I even go back to the beginning, I ran Phandalin, and I could feel the players growing attached to Phandalin. If you're using a module that's really well fleshed out and you run it well and you give the players good content and good relationships with characters, I've found its opposite is a concern. Now, players are going to be glued to your story if they've enjoyed it and the characters that they've built relationship with, the NPCs. So if you just do your due diligence to create just engaging characters, that's something I'm bad at. Personally, that I'm really working on right now as a DM, is I'm just focusing on making NPCs, figuring out who they are, figuring out why they're there, why they're important, are they good, are they bad. That way when players run into an NPC, you're not looking on your random name chart. If you're having to look on your random name chart a lot in a world where you have already done a good amount of bottom-up construction, I would argue that maybe that should be the clue that you're actually not doing bottom up. You're probably looking more from the top down, because, you know, the more characters that they're interacting with that you haven't thought of, or you don't have a niche that can fill, that breaks the illusion to the players, I think, and that can lead to really flat, generic NPCs, and boredom's your enemy in a game. If players are bored with your world or your game, that's naturally going to want them to go, oh, this place sucks, I'm going to go somewhere else. And then if that place is blank, your game probably is done. You know, or too many sessions like that, you're probably going to get frustrated and quit. The players are probably not going to show. You're going to have absenteeism and stuff like that. So that was just a diatribe that came to me.
Well, that's one of the strengths of the bottom up, is that, or the middle out, is that since you are starting small, you have the opportunity to make several NPCs who are interesting, and like creating NPCs as a dungeon master is like fly fishing. You're casting the line constantly, hoping that the player characters will bite on something. And if you're doing it from the bottom up, you're going to know a location pretty well. You're going to know the immediate vicinity. You're going to know who the important people in the area are. And it's more likely that if you put more investment into a group of characters, at least one of them will be somebody who the player characters grab onto and become like a dog with a bone and not want to give up interacting with that player character. I've seen it happen a dozen times of characters who just, for whatever reason, the player characters just fall in love with an NPC the first time they show up, and it's like, I mean, it's like trying to wrench a bone away from a dog, trying to get them to focus on anything else other than like this NPC's life.
But that's true. I mean, and that, I guess that I never thought about that, making an NPC so cool that they start to dive into parts of that character's life you haven't thought about. You can kind of run off the page with a character's backstory too. I never really thought of that.
You can the dungeon master cannot create a player or create an NPC that the player characters are going to glom onto like that. The best thing the dungeon master can do is create a variety of NPCs and wait for the moment when one of the player characters grabs onto that particular NPC. I've never been able to predict which NPC that my player characters fall in love with.
And sometimes that's fun, though. And that's another thing, too, that I think a DM needs to be aware of, is that sometimes it's okay to let them ride and to give an NPC a bigger life than you either intended to, or that you have an NPC that fills a certain story connection, but like some random NPC that you hadn't imagined was worth anything was what the players tend to gravitate to, where they like that particular NPC. You know, big that NPC up, you know, as time goes on. You know, maybe shift some plot points over to that NPC. Make a connection that you hadn't imagined that NPC is going to make. Just because if the players like them, you know, use that. You know, don't be afraid to graft some new stuff onto it just because you have imagined who they are. You know, I always liked it whenever the players tend to enhance an NPC that I hadn't otherwise kind of thought. Like Alonka is a perfect example in my game. There's the lady that gave them the key into Barovia. That was just a throwaway NPC that just served that simple purpose. But as the game's gone on, it's grown into a bigger thing. And, you know, all of a sudden that character's going to have a bigger part moving forward. And that's okay. You know, that's actually good.
Here's a question as far as stats and stuff for NPCs like that. Since we're talking about starting out really small, one example that just came to mind from your game, Eliot, was when we first met Ezek. I have no idea how tough he was at the time, but he was definitely presented as somebody that could very likely take any one of us one-on-one. You know, when we first encountered the dude, that was the way he was presented. I don't know how he would have fared against the whole group. Probably wouldn't have been able to take us all, but you know, big capable dude, and we're 3rd level, something like that, walking into Ravenloft. So by the end of it, though, we're 9th, 10th level, whatever. Do you level up Ezek along with us? Are the people that we used to, look up to or be afraid of eventually, just clearly surpassed by us? Like, how do you navigate, the relative power dynamics between player characters and NPCs as the game progresses? What do you guys think?
I'd like to hear Clayton's thoughts on this before I jump in.
Well, I don't think that Ezek should be leveled up, especially if we're in the situation where we encounter him, but we're reticent to fight him. I mean, I don't think we were reticent to fight him because we thought he was going to kick our asses. I agree, Jordan, that probably if any one of us would have fought him, he might have taken us out. But I don't think there would, even when we first met him, I don't think he could have stood against the entirety of the party.
That's correct.
The fact that this is somebody who at one point we viewed as a threat, but then we grew to where we knew that he was just another person who either we had to decide whether we were going to protect him and help him with the struggle that he was going through, again, like with his dealings with Strahd, or whether we were going to just take him out because while he wasn't a threat to us, he was a threat to the things that we cared about in the world. I think that allowing the player characters to grow and be stronger than an opponent and let that inform their decision of how they deal with that opponent, I think that's a great way to grow the world and show that the characters are growing and they're further developing the world and further developing their interaction with the world.
Yeah, I think it's really NPC dependent. That's a crappy answer, but I think a better example than Ezek is Irina. In the story arc, her character was super changed compared to the book as written, because in the book she's the individual that Strahd wanted. I changed it to a party member because I had a female in the party and I wanted to take advantage of that, and so that her entire purpose in Strahd really dissolved, and so I struggled with figuring it out. And then you guys gave her the role as kind of like the stand-in Lord of Vallaki. So looking at her character sheet, she's nothing. She's like 15 hit points or something like that. She is described as a somewhat capable warrior, but she's, like a CR1 quarter, something like that. So in my mind, that particular NPC has lived an adventuring life. She's had a lot of experience, and more importantly, she's an ally. Allies that survive the campaign with you guys, especially if they serve like a leadership role, you can imagine they've adventured, I guess you could say. Well, yeah, I mean, you should level that NPC up because there's a good chance you guys are going to recruit them into a dangerous situation. And I mean, what are you going to do? Throw her into a adventuring party of 8 level characters and she's got 15 hit points? But on the converse, if you have like Ezek, who was basically an antagonist most of the game, I mean, he was stout. He had, I think, 15 hit points, I think. Something like that. And so he would have been a challenge, but even from the beginning, you guys could have defeated him, and now you could easily dispatch him. That he's a flat character, 2-dimensional, just a tough. He serves a very narrow role in the game. He shouldn't, the party should outgrow him if they were to take him up as a challenge, because that would be a sense of, that tells the players, yes, you guys are awesome. Look how much you've grown. This guy used to be intimidating, now he's not. But then on the other hand, I have an antagonist from Phandalin, the wizard that was the big bad in Phandalin. You guys are still on his trail. For him to be worth chasing, or for you, when you guys follow up and find him again, if I kept those stats the same, it would be such a letdown if he was that much of a pushover. So I leveled him and will likely level him again since he lived. But I think it's very situational, and it needs to always serve the party and the greater story and just serve to make things fun for the players. That's the main thing. Like Alonka, perfect example. You guys might interact with her a lot, but she's just a commoner, essentially, NPC. She'll probably always be, because, that would be her role. You guys are protecting people like her. So for her to be this able warrior, or able something, would almost defeat the purpose. Unless, we decide to go in a different direction. And then I could see it, but you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it all depends on the level of threat or the level of capability that the person needs to have in relation to the party. Like, yeah, I completely agree with you on, what was it, Black Spider or something? Since we've got a bone to pick with him, yeah, absolutely. He should remain a threat to us. He should be something that we strive to defeat. And his stats should increase proportionately until we get to the point where we are able to finally pin him down. I think that with Ezek, I don't know if he was supposed to be this recurring threat to our group in the way that the Black Spider has grown to be. I kind of see Ezek as, and like you said, it's very situational based on the NPC, but I see Ezek as kind of being this big fish in a little pond that was Valaki. And people like that generally don't get more powerful. They don't go on to bigger and better things. Whereas a recurring villain who has shown up in multiple different locations, like you said, they have been adventuring too, as the player characters have. And yeah, it's totally logical for them to increase in their capability, similarly to what the player characters are doing.
Yeah, I mean, just for I don't want to beat this dead horse anymore, but just for the listeners, I know we're kind of on the tail end of this, but if you're not familiar, Ezek is a perfect example of an NPC dropped into a module that the role changed. He went from he was just a tough leader of the guard in a small town. So he was meant to kind of bully the party around a little bit to kind of nudge them towards story plots or away from story plots. And that's pretty much all once that role, you guys eventually liberated the town, he was kind of on the outs. At that point, he's just off the board. And, but, anytime that, even if it's in a game you create, I think that those are general guidelines that you should follow, that, big bads encountered when the players are small, they deserve the right to bully that bully. You know what I mean? But, if you're building up a character to be tough, I mean, even in Phandalin, for instance, the Black Spider in Phandalin as the big bad was actually a failure of that module. He's not. Even for the players at third or fourth level, he's not much of a challenge. So, make sure that if you big somebody up to be a worthy foe, they better be a worthy foe. Or else, in my mind, I think the players will be almost let down by, like, look, we chased this guy all over the world, and this is all we have. This is it. This is all he was. You know what I mean? Maybe, I don't know, maybe that I'm of a different viewpoint, but, people should live up to their legend.
I kind of see the party's interaction with the Black Spider is kind of like any of the villains, any of the characters in Batman's Rogues Gallery. Batman's defeated them before, but each time Batman has to oppose them, it is a challenge for him. He has to overcome things, and it's not that their power level is appropriate for Batman at every point, but the numerous thugs that Batman beats up on a nightly basis, those are just there to be fodder. If you've got a villain who is there literally just to be fodder and the player characters don't take an interest in them, yeah, that's the type of character that doesn't advance. That shouldn't become more. And kind of tie that back into the bottom up approach. That's constant world building. You're constantly adding to that character. The character started small, and as interactions happened, there got to be more and more detail. And that's the way that the bottom up kind of teaches you to do, is that the more interaction the player characters have with something, the more information and the more detail that it is supposed to have in the campaign for the characters to then have more more reason to interact with in the future.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because you just sparked my mind. Something we haven't talked a lot about. Oh, we kind of gone in and out of it, but really, it's clear to me that our opinion, our consensus is that you have to have a big plan. You have to have a sense of the big top-down ideas. But really, most of your time spent as a GM creating content should be focused on that bottom-up. Where are they? Who's around them? How does this link into the broader plot? But that being said, how do you guys ever build games? If you're imagining a campaign, you're having to kind of keep in mind, well, my players are level 5 now, and what are they going to be doing? Where do I plan on them to be at level 15? Because me personally, I like to imagine a broader thread of a bigger narrative that really ultimately will lead to the end point in the game. So and to me, that's a very top-down concept. How do you thread in things like foreshadowing, keeping a storyline consistent and interesting from early game when you're doing mostly local top-up, bottom-up stuff, but still keeping in mind that you've got a bigger thing you want them to interact with?
Well, the way I'm doing it in my Scarred Marches game is that at the very beginning of the game, I had literally one sentence of where the, quote, big bad of the area was going to be. And the big bad isn't actually no, I've got a player who's listening to this. I'm not going to go into details about that. But because I had that one line of what the conclusion of a large campaign arc was going to be, that allows me, as I'm going through and I'm making random rolls for encounters on the road, or as I'm designing the adventures that they're going on as they're advancing further out on this imaginary concentric circle that I have around the keep, that allows me to throw in additional details. And not all of these details were set at the beginning. The enemy for the main campaign, the quote final enemy, is still in development for that game. I don't know exactly what they're going to fight in that final confrontation. It's still being evolved based on what the player characters have shown interest in, and the types of things that they have randomly encountered is constantly shaping what that final mission is going to be. And it, like you said, as far as continuity, that's incredibly hard to keep track of. I'm throwing out little bits of information and hurriedly scribbling it down so that I can remember to, one, tie it back into everything else that's been happening so far, and to, two, come up with some sort of a detail so that whenever they get back to the keep and they decide, okay, I'm going to research this family of this barrow of interred elves that we encountered and we know the family name, we're going to go back to the keep and research that. Well, shit, I've got to actually figure out what you're going to discover whenever you research that, and figure out how that plays into the overall story that has been developing at this point. So unlike the top-down perspective or approach where all of that information would have been decided at the start, as the issues come up, I'm grappling with them. I'm twisting them to fit with the narrative that has happened so far. Yes, there are times when there are inconsistencies, and I've got to figure out a way to either retcon it or explain it away, because as in the real world, history is kind of sketchy once you go back a certain distance. There aren't complete records. So that kind of gives me an out in that there are going to be inconsistencies, because in the real world there are inconsistencies. We don't know literally everything that has happened. There are things that happen that are contradictory. There are like how many stories are there of ancient rulers who we know very little about, and then their local magistrates or their enemies write histories, and so we come up with completely different pictures of what was actually going on.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with, and that's something that as a DM I think I've had to grow into over the years, is like there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, you're going to find an answer to that next week. So I'll get back to you on that one. Oh, that's a really good idea. I'm glad you thought of that. And I'll instead of trying to riff in the moment, usually riffing in the moment when it comes to almost anything is bad news. But if you're having to do it too much, you're probably not putting in enough prep from session to session.
Yeah, and foreshadowing is a really tough one. I don't know how I feel about foreshadowing in role playing games. Like, I guess it's fine as like a hint of certain things that are to come that you're going to face or that exist in the world or whatever. But I wouldn't try to do the clever narrative sprinkling thing that you see authors and filmmakers able to do, where you connect themes early on in the story to how things work out in the end and try to bring it all full circle and all this stuff. Like that requires way too much control over everything. You can do that if you're the only one involved in the story creation, but I think that trying to do that in a role-playing game is sort of confusing, like what the medium is about and what it's capable of. So I wouldn't try to get too artsy-fartsy about that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Totally. I mean, it's something I fall victim to a lot because I am more of a top-down and I imagine this grander world, but you're absolutely right. Usually in moments where I try to give some sort of gleaning about something far to come, I usually look back on it and go, oh man, I don't like that now, or that doesn't fit the game. And you just end up having this dangling storyline or this misleading, bit of plot point that maybe your players bite on, sessions and sessions later, and you're like, oh crap, I forgot about that. That was a bad idea, and I threw that away, and now what do? It's just kind of like a little embarrassing moment, kind of like the Fanes. Like, looking back on it, I changed and made a change to Strahd where these spirits that inhabit the realm that Strahd stole power from, and in the moment it was a good idea, and I kind of dangled that they were important, but by the time they actually came to fruition, I was like, these kind of don't make sense. I didn't really put enough effort into fleshing them out now, and now they just kind of look like a silly little part of the game that's a bit stupid. So, that's going to happen from time to time. Just letting the players play the game is almost always the better call.
Here's an example of something that happened 15 years ago in a game I was in, that explains foreshadowing and in the bottom up approach. We were playing a Vampire Dark Ages game, and we were more than halfway through the chronicle at that time, and for some reason we were all sitting around, kind of in between adventures, or on our pilgrimage. We were on our way to Jerusalem, and it suddenly dawned on us, like all of these characters that we made, we all have this thing going on where, like, you're estranged from your sire. You've got this thing that's going on with your, this other childer who was also created by your sire. So we all realized that we had this common thread within our group. In all of the characters that we had made this one common theme independently of each other that all played in together. And I remember glancing over at the storyteller as we were explaining this. I watched the storyteller's eyes get a little bit big, and then they frantically picked up a pen and started writing something down. So whenever you're doing the bottom up, it's not about planning out planning out the foreshadowing. It's about seeing the different, like, after they've happened, picking up on the themes that have come up, the recurring things that have come up. And once you start seeing this pattern, you can reinforce the pattern and make it something that the campaign has been about all along.
Right. That's so true.
Yeah, a party of characters is always going to be more clever than any one DM can possibly be.
Yeah, I struggle with it too because one of the ways that I don't love role playing game design. I guess the games that I really find the least engaging are the endless fellowship session games, where you're just kind of going from small module to small module, I guess you could say. And so the party's always on the road. They're always going to a dungeon. They're always going to a bad guy's lair, or they're always going to find this something. They go there, they do it, and then off to the next one. And, these series of bigger and bigger stair-stepping but isolated plot lines, to me, I don't know, for some reason, I've always felt like some continuity is useful, but maybe that's just a failing of me as a DM. Just the games that I grew up on, my favorite, I played a D&D game once, ran by a really great DM, and he pulled this off, at least to my teenage mind, really well, where, we leveled pretty high over the course of a game from 1, and there was strong story continuity from beginning to end. And I remember, he had copied over Nazgul basically into his world and renamed them, but they were basically Nazgul. And I just remember how fun it was to, struggle with these just impossibly difficult NPCs early on. I remember we had to flee from them because we all knew that they were too big for our britches. And then finally getting to that level where we conquered one. And then, this was at huge different jumps in the storyline. And, we finally felt ourselves overcoming the obstacle that then allowed us to finally confront this bad guy that we had been, that had been our antagonist for, months and months and months. And I just always loved that. And so when I'm building a game, I think I'm always kind of emulating that. But, that's hard to pull off.
So what would you guys say are some of the best types of games to run with the bottom-up approach? We've talked about, Jordan, Apocalyptia, that type where it's the end of the world. That seems to be a really good fit for the bottom up. I think it works really well because that type of a game is very focused on who the characters are and their daily struggle, their sometimes hourly struggle to survive. I think that the reason why it works is because it is such a personal game. You're not worried about what's happening in the kingdom next to you. You're focused on, can I get food in my mouth and water and into me in order to survive the next day? I think the more granular the focus of the game, the more this bottom up structure really works well for the game.
Yeah, it's sort of the complete inversion of the normal concerns in the, hero's journey type of quest that Eliot was talking about that you always see in D&D. Because in those, it's almost always like, how do we avert the end of the world that this and that bad guy is, trying to hatch? But by the time you're in a post-apocalyptic thing, the worst case scenario has already happened. And your concerns are, for yourself and your comrades around you. And you literally just don't have any power to fix things. It's just all fucked already. And so, yeah, it's like holding it together, getting some food to eat, making sure you have enough bullets, stuff like that. You try in a D&D game to get player characters that personally involved with things that are going on in the way that they kind of automatically are, just to continue existing in a post-apocalyptic kind of scenario. And the challenge is flipped also in that, like, how do you get those player characters to care about other people's problems and, get them on any kind of like hero arc and, bought in to put some skin in the game for some particular cause when they're so jaded and damaged already.
It's tough. It's tough to hold people in. Yeah, definitely bottom up. I really go back to I think I mentioned this a little earlier. I do think that the approaches are more about the type of person that's running the game and designing the game, I think you can bend almost any system to it. I think lethal games really ought to be very bottom up because they're probably not going to be that long lived. I mean, they're probably not going to be, a 2-year campaign. Maybe they will. I haven't played a lot of them that have gone that long. Usually they have a very concise, straightforward story, and then it's off to the next idea. I think that if you plan on running a big, long game, like endless, with no set end game, I think, bottom up needs to be your bread and butter, but top down needs to be kind of almost, it's almost like I go back to, Lord of the Rings, basically. I think that, the narrative of the Lord of the Rings was about these individuals and their arc, and they didn't see the whole world. But you're necessarily going to need to have some secondary knowledge about the world that they're playing in. So I think D&D and fantasy. I will say this though. What do you guys think? I think that especially old Vampire was very top down, and I don't know, because it always seemed like when we were playing in World of Darkness, especially vampire games, I mean, they were so time spanning, and you're immortal, and they almost need to have this more of a top down approach to the narrative, and then the players just kind of explore it. And I never really found, you know what I mean? But I don't know. Even still, you have to be doing the day-to-day work of where are my players at, why are they there, and how can I make this feel more real? And that's going to just be putting your head down and grinding out NPCs and making maps and making quests, and you got to put in that, you got to have those random encounters, and you got to know these details. And I don't see how that can be not in every single game. And the majority of the time that you spend DMing or prepping, you have to be thinking more bottom up.
Yeah, regardless of what methods you start the campaign at, you are going to be using bottom up, middle out to create each individual adventure that is going to happen, each individual session. You have to make those the middle out, because you have to start with what the players have around them and figure out where they're going to go from there. And it's pointless to detail a whole bunch of stuff about the next town over if the player characters are not going to be going to that town until they're level 10. If they're only level 3 right now. So it forces you to focus only on what is immediately around the player characters, what they can reasonably be expected to go toward, and grow the campaign out from there. And it doesn't matter if you started with the first step of creating a world was to decide what the gods were in the world. Eventually, each game will become a bottom up exercise in world creation, because that's each session. Each session is a bottom up world creation.
I think that's just that's something that some DMs really thrive on it. I think the original. I went back for whenever we were researching the world building, I just spent a couple of hours just looking at the very first modules, looking at chainmail, looking at just the very first, adventures that were designed to kind of get an idea of what did the creators and first players really envision suited this. And it's all bottom up. It's extremely sparse, world building. And usually it was even just placed in some random fictional world, usually Middle Earth. But it was very detailed about the dungeons, the bad guys, the traps, the obstacles, small towns were the first kind of progression from that. The first secondary, people who made secondary content for D&D, a lot of those people were peddling essentially modules. Here's an entire town with a bunch of NPCs, just to give a little bit more depth. But it took a long time before they even attempted to create Greyhawk itself. I think the early 70s, mid 70s is whenever the earliest content was being made, and it wasn't until the early 80s before a concise campaign world was first published under D&D. Am I wrong in that? Anybody else? Am I getting my history right?
I don't know if your years are correct, but the idea is definitely correct. That it was created. The world was the dungeons, and whenever the player characters left the dungeons, they needed somewhere to go, so that content was created as well. And that's how Greyhawk was originally created. I'm pretty sure that's how a lot of Forgotten Realms was created. But yeah.
So baked into the very first game, the original creators of D&D were pretty unified in that, it's really all about what's in front of them right now. What's going on in the greater world wasn't really seen as a big priority.
Well, here's something like we were talking about before the show, Clayton. I feel like the culture of D&D has gotten away from the DIY elements of things to some extent. And back then, the idea was that you would have these separate little modules, like software engineering, like I was talking about, that you could drop into different things. Like when you're designing a world, don't think about just this one game. You're going to be running a bunch of games. You're going to have a bunch of different worlds. There's no reason to redo every village. If you've got a fucking good village, put that away in your folder somewhere, and whenever you need it, pull it out. Like NPCs, reuse them all the time. I mean, the software that runs the internet is a handful of very important modules that everybody's using over and over again, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. If you got something that's great, get a lot of mileage out of it. And, nothing beats a good castle. Nothing beats a good caravan. Solid NPCs. Maybe there are player characters that you played in previous games that you just want to, have a cameo in your game again. Something like that. Save your stuff. I've got binders and binders full of shit that I've run over the years, and if I'm going to run something similar to anything I've ever done before, believe me, I'm going to go back and see what I can pilfer from myself.
I completely side note, but on that, they're one of the things that I'm bad about is that thing. I usually, over the years, I've gone through lulls where I don't game for a while, and whenever things just sit on your shelf for a while, they lose value. And then you pick it back up again, and you really regret tossing that folder or giving away that book years earlier. But I went to my cousin's one day over the summer. I think it was 2 years ago, and he was having a yard sale. And I just stopped in and said hi, and he just lit up and said, "Oh, I've got something for you." And apparently at one time my dad was cleaning out the garage and was helping him, and he found a box full of my stuff from when I was a teenager, and in it was a folder, a giant binder of my very first campaign setting. And he pulled it out and gave it to me. He said, I just couldn't throw this away. And that is like maybe one of my top 5 most cherished objects now, because it's and there's not a whole lot in it I can reuse, but just having it, I've poured back over it, and there are now big chunks of this game that I'm in that I've pulled right out of that old game just because, for my own sake. The more you accumulate, the better off you're going to be, and the more fun the players are going to have.
And if it worked the first time, it's probably going to work the second and third and fourth.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah. And refine it. I mean, it'll get better with every iteration if you're paying attention.
For sure.
Well, we're starting to go just a little bit long, so why don't we go on to geek things? I only have one geek thing. It is a YouTube video that I found. The video will be linked in the show notes, and it is The Lord of the Rings as it was released, but there has been one editing thing changed about it. And this editing thing changed about it is that every time Samwise Gamgee takes one step further away from home, it replays him saying, "If I take one more step, it'll be the furthest I've ever been from home." And then it has Frodo coming on, "Come on, Sam." And then he takes another step forward, and then the cycle repeats. I found it just the concept of it just absolutely hilarious. So that is my geek thing this week.
Go ahead, Jordan.
My geek thing is my brand new monitor. Let me tell y'all something. The crazy perks that y'all have heard about software engineers, it's all true. It's a fucking sweet gig, and man, get into it. My company paid for a new monitor for me, and like a $900 monitor. It's amazing. It's ultra wide screen. It's 49 inches. It's the Samsung Odyssey. It's called a CHG 90. It's a QLED monitor. It's like 144 hertz refresh rate. It's like a 32:9 aspect ratio. It's curved. I mean, it's incredible. Like, it has completely changed my life. I've had it for one day, and I would knife fight somebody that tried to take it from me at this point. It's so fucking cool. I think a new version has come out since then that's like $1,500 or whatever. So you can probably catch this one on a decently hot deal. I got it at Best Buy just now. But man, it's amazing. It's heavy as fuck. It takes up like my whole desk. But holy shit, I've never seen something so cool. So yeah.
I mean, that's,
Samsung.
On that note, like, it's funny how you just assume, being kind of a nerd and geeky kind of person, as the 21st century rolls on, that kind of everybody else is kind of putting these new, like, just using two monitors. I'd never used two monitors. I know people have used two monitors since the 90s, but just the way that changed my life, and seeing, I'm just amazed at how many people are still resistant to adopting, like, all the abilities that technology is giving us. And teaching in the pandemic, I have a lot of coworkers who are really struggling technology-wise. And, they're choosing to bring kids in during a pandemic because they prefer to work with them one-on-one because they don't have the skill set to take advantage of the suite of Google programs and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, like, I'm doing a lot better from this medium. Like, having two monitors, using Google Meet, sharing screens, taking other, all these powers that we have in our Google technology. Like, I'm actually a lot more productive. The kids get more done. Anyway, it's a big giant curved monitor, would, I think, make some people kind of hold their nose like nerd, but good Lord.
It's amazing. And to bring it back to role playing, when we're going to be doing Roll20 stuff, like, you've got one browser window over on the left side that's your Roll20 like map and all that stuff. You can pull out your character sheet to be its own separate window, so that's going to be on my smaller laptop screen. And then on the right side of the panel, I've got, my player handbook or whatever book I'm looking at open, double-paged view with bookmark side panel open. Like, you couldn't possibly be gaming more efficiently than this. You'd have to have some kind of Neuralink thing or fucking holodeck. Like, this is the way to do it in 2020.
Well, so I came in with one. I've always been a fan of constructed languages, and it's always been kind of on the bucket list. And so over the last few months, something I've been working on in the background is, like, I've really been diving into what kind of languages I want to build for this world. And I've just gone full Tolkien, and I've decided I'm going to make a completely constructed language like Esperanto or Quenya. And there's a whole community out there who does this. But the tool that I've found so useful is called the Language Construction Kit. It's an online guide off the website Zompus, which will be linked in the show notes, I'm sure. If it's fun reading if you've ever kind of even thought how to even do something like that. It's been really transformative in a lot of ways for just understanding our own language. Like, I know English. I'm a much better English writer now than I was before I started doing it, because I had to, like, relearn syntax and perspective and all those things. But anyway, Language Construction Kit, go check it out. It's a super nerdy, awesome thing to get into. You can also buy an expanded version off Amazon in book form, and it's on my Christmas list. So if no one buys it for me, I'm going to buy it for myself.
All right, guys. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.